Hello everyone. We all, as Christians, believe that the Gospels were written by their respective authors, but can we believe without any doubts? Do we have any reasons for believing that? Let's explore the reasons for believing the same. For this, we are looking at some excerpts from Lee Strobel's Case for Christ. Tell me this, I said with an edge of challenge in my voice, is it really possible to be an intelligent, critically thinking person and still believe that the four Gospels were written by the people whose names have been attached to them? Blomberg set his cup of coffee on the edge of his desk and looked intently at me. The answer is yes, he said with conviction. He sat back and continued. It's important to acknowledge that, strictly speaking, the Gospels are anonymous. But the uniform testimony of the early church was that Matthew, also known as Levi, the tax collector and one of the 12 disciples, was the author of the first Gospel in the New Testament, that John Mark, a companion of Peter, was the author of the Gospel we call Mark, and that Luke, known as Paul's beloved physician, wrote both the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. How uniform was the belief that they were the authors? I asked. There are no known competitors for these three Gospels, he said. Apparently, it was just not in dispute. Even so, I wanted to test the issue further. Excuse my skepticism, I said, but would anyone have had a motivation to lie by claiming these people wrote these Gospels, when they really didn't? Blomberg shook his head. Probably not. Remember, these were unlikely characters, he said, a grin breaking on his face. Mark and Luke weren't even among the 12 disciples. Matthew was, but as a former hated tax collector, he would have been the most infamous character next to Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus. Contrast this with what happened when the fanciful apocryphal Gospels were written much later. People chose the names of well-known and exemplary figures to be their fictitious authors: Philip, Peter, Mary, James. Those names carried a lot more weight than the names of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So to answer your question, there would not have been any reason to attribute authorship to these three less respected people if it weren't true. That sounded logical, but it was obvious that he was conveniently leaving out one of the Gospel writers. What about John? I asked. He was extremely prominent. In fact, he wasn't just one of the 12 disciples but one of Jesus' inner three, along with James and Peter. Yes, he's the one exception, Blomberg conceded with a nod. And interestingly, John is the only Gospel about which there is some question about authorship. What exactly is in dispute? The name of the author isn't in doubt, it's certainly John. Blomberg replied. The question is whether it was John the Apostle or a different John. You see, the testimony of a Christian writer named Papias, dated about AD 125, refers to John the Apostle and John the Elder, and it's not clear from the context whether he's talking about one person from two perspectives or two different people. But granted that exception, the rest of the early testimony is unanimous that it was John the Apostle, the son of Zebedee, who wrote the Gospel. And, I said in an effort to pin him down further, you're convinced that he did? Yes, I believe the substantial majority of the material goes back to the Apostle, he replied. However, if you read the Gospel closely, you can see some indication that its concluding verses may have been finalized by an editor. Personally, I have no problem believing that somebody closely associated with John may have functioned in that role, putting the last verses into shape and potentially creating the stylistic uniformity of the entire document. But in any event, he stressed, the Gospel is obviously based on eyewitness material, as are the other three Gospels. While I appreciated Blomberg's comments so far, I wasn't ready to move on yet. The issue of who wrote the Gospels is tremendously important, and I wanted specific details: names, dates, quotations. I finished off my coffee and put the cup on his desk. Pen poised, I prepared to dig deeper. Let's go back to Mark, Matthew, and Luke, I said. What specific evidence do you have that they are the authors of the Gospels? Blomberg leaned forward. Again, the oldest and probably most significant testimony comes from Papias, who in about AD 125 specifically affirmed that Mark had carefully and accurately recorded Peter's eyewitness observations. In fact, he said Mark made no mistake and did not include any false statement. And Papias said Matthew had preserved the teachings of Jesus as well. Then Irenaeus, writing about AD 180, confirmed the traditional authorship. In fact, here he said, reaching for a book. He flipped it open and read Irenaeus' words. Matthew published his own gospel among the Hebrews in their own tongue, when Peter and Paul were preaching the gospel in Rome and founding the church there. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, himself handed down to us in writing the substance of Peter's preaching. Luke, the follower of Paul, set down in a book the gospel preached by his teacher. Then John, the disciple of the Lord, who also leaned on his breast, himself produced his gospel, while he was living at Ephesus in Asia. I looked up from the notes I was taking. Okay, let me clarify this, I said. If we can have confidence that the Gospels were written by the disciples Matthew and John, by Mark, the companion of the disciple Peter, and by Luke, the historian, companion of Paul, and sort of a first-century journalist, we can be assured that the events they record are based on either direct or indirect eyewitness testimony. As I was speaking, Blomberg was mentally sifting my words. When I finished, he nodded. Exactly, he said crisply. There were still some troubling aspects of the Gospels that I needed to clarify. In particular, I wanted to better understand the kind of literary genre they represented. When I go to the bookstore and look in the biography section, I don't see the same kind of writing that I see in the Gospels, I said. When somebody writes a biography these days, they thoroughly delve into the person's life. But look at Mark, he doesn't talk about the birth of Jesus or really anything through Jesus' early adult years. Instead he focuses on a 3-year period and spends half his gospel on the events leading up to and culminating in Jesus' last week. How do you explain that? Blomberg held up a couple of fingers. There are 2 reasons, he replied. One is literary and the other is theological. The literary reason is that basically, this is how people wrote biographies in the ancient world. They did not have the sense, as we do today, that it was important to give equal proportion to all periods of an individual's life or that it was necessary to tell the story in strictly chronological order or even to quote people verbatim, as long as the essence of what they said was preserved. Ancient Greek and Hebrew didn't even have a symbol for quotation marks. The only purpose for which they thought history was worth recording was because there were some lessons to be learned from the characters described. Therefore the biographer wanted to dwell at length on those portions of the person's life that were exemplary, that were illustrative, that could help other people, that gave meaning to a period of history. And what's the theological reason? I asked. It flows out of the point I just made. Christians believe that as wonderful as Jesus' life and teachings and miracles were, they were meaningless were not historically factual, that Christ died and was raised from the dead and that this provided atonement, or forgiveness, of the sins of humanity. So Mark in particular, as the writer of probably the earliest Gospel, devotes roughly half his narrative to the events leading up to and including 1 week's period of time and culminating in Christ's death and resurrection. Given the significance of the crucifixion, he concluded, this makes perfect sense in ancient literature.